I've been looking forward to this presentation. Last year, I have a group on Friday mornings of pastors that meet with GoToMeeting, and we've discussed various theological issues, topics, and we read through the books together. We have a fun time. We pray together. There's usually between 20 and 25 online every Friday morning. And Bruce has been part of our group for a couple of years. I've known Bruce for several years. He's a pastor of Washington County Bible Church. He's got his PhD from Baptist Bible Seminary. And he's written quite a few articles and a wonderful book called Spiritual Maturity that is in the same vein as Louis Sperry Chafer's He That Is Spiritual. He has ALS. And so we have seen him over the last few years go through his battle with ALS, and we continue to pray for him. That's why he's in the wheelchair. Some of you knew that. A lot of you are probably going, why is the guy in a wheelchair?
Because I can't walk.
Sometimes he can't think, but we have a great time. We have a great time kidding each other, and we have a tremendous time. He has a great sense of humor, and I love him very much as a brother in Christ and appreciate his scholarship and look forward to his presentation today from Romans chapter 1, dealing with an extremely significant and important topic that relates to our understanding of our knowledge of God, and especially in the arena of how this applies to apologetics, Romans 1, 18 to 21. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Baker and let him take over.
I asked Robbie, am I on? Can you hear me all right? All right, good. I don't have the breath I once did, so it used to be I could speak and everybody'd hear me without a mic, and those days are not quite with us any longer. Are we all set on the volume here? Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stand in the way of the sinful, nor sit in the seat of the scornful. It's better than testing 1, 2, 3, isn't it? Yeah. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. And he will be like a tree firmly planted by rivers of water, which brings forth its fruit in its season. Its leaf also does not wither. Whatever he does prospers. I can hear kind of an echo up here.
Yeah. It's just not quite loud enough. It's like maybe your mic isn't close enough to your mouth.
I love that perfume you're wearing. You have to love me, Robbie. Those are the rules. All right. Okay, we all set? Okay, good. Robbie asked me to speak on this topic, and I haven't quite forgiven him for that yet. He rather insisted on it. And the reason I say that is because this is a very technical subject, and we're going to deal with it in a technical way. Originally, this information was presented at the 1997 annual meeting of the Evangelical Theological Society in California, where a bunch of pointy-headed intellectuals gathered to discuss things that may or may not have to do with the Bible. This was originally published in Bibliotheca Sacra under the title that we have here, and we'll see it as we go on. I'm going to throw in a disclaimer. Not everything in this presentation has been properly footnoted. That's why I've included in this presentation the original paper that I presented at ETS. If you want to find out where I got this information, if you want to see what are the appropriate citations and so forth, it's all there, okay? So you can see it. It's not necessarily in here. But I don't want to be, plagiarizing or anything. That's the reason I threw that in there. You'll find the paper and the footnotes along with a bibliography in that paper, and I'm assuming you all have that. Now, as again, I said this is a very technical topic, and it's. I think, though, I'm looking around the room, and everyone appears to me to be of above average intelligence in here. So I think we're going to be okay, and I want you to be happy that you came. Of course, when I say that I want you to be happy that you came, that's kind of an ambiguous statement, is it? And what is it we need to do in order to be happy in a presentation like this? Well, Barry Schwartz, in his great book, Why More is Less, The Paradox of Choice, Why More is Less, writes about what it takes to be happy. Let's see if we can get any wisdom out of this book.
The secret to happiness is low expectations.
Okay, so I think that if we keep that in mind, we'll all be great. Okay, so let's move on to our topic here, and first begin with a man by the name of S.H. Kellogg and what he had to say about religion. S.H. Kellogg says that man should be defined as a religious animal, not a rational one, that man is universally religious. He notes that human beings should be considered unlike the rest of the animal kingdom because man alone is a religious animal. According to Kellogg, defining man as a rational animal is not sufficiently narrow because some of the animals with that are of the higher level of animals not only operate under the realm of instinct, but they also possess true reasoning. But no one, he says, has ventured to soberly maintain that some animals are also religious. To speak of the religion of a monkey or a dog or a horse were only to excite a smile. Now, no doubt, he writes, when we thus speak of religion as universal, we must use the word religion in a very broad sense. But however broad the sense you want to use it, it's still true that the possession of a religious faculty is one of the most distinctive characteristics of the human race. He puts it like this: man only is religious, and in the case of man, religion, in some form or another, often no doubt very vague and ill-defined, is universal. It is yet to be proved that any tribe has ever been found so degraded as to be utterly destitute of religious ideas. The assertions to the contrary, which have often been made, have repeatedly, by further investigation, been shown to be erroneous. Now, if man is universally religious, we can also state that there are certain universal religious beliefs. For example, every religious system assumes the existence of a higher power or powers upon which a person is dependent and which can influence his personal destiny. Again, Kellogg writes, as to the nature of the power assumed, religions differ. Some regard the power as only one. Others assume a plurality of such powers. It is, however, important to observe that in most, if not all cases, where men worship God many, there is discoverable in the background of the religious consciousness the dim outline of one sole power, of which the many who are worshipped are either different manifestations or to which they hold a position strictly subordinate. Second, he says, due to a person's relationship with this power or powers, certain actions are required and others must be avoided, or suffering will result. Third, this is the one I find the most interesting, between mankind and this power or powers, something is wrong. Put another way, all religions more or less distinctly express or appeal to man's sense of sin. All religions do this. Again, to quote Kellogg, this is clear from various familiar facts, but is especially evident from the wide prevalence of religious offerings and sacrifices designed to propitiate or conciliate the goodwill of the being worshipped, to whom the offerer feels himself subordinate and whose favor he believes to be necessary to his well-being. Finally, all religions assume there is a state of existence after death that is affected by the actions taken by a person in this life. Kellogg actually has one other part of this universal religious system. He says that all people feel that they are born into this system and they can do nothing to change that. Now, Kellogg says that these tenets are true for all religions, regardless of whether they're monotheistic, polytheistic, pantheistic, panentheistic, non-theistic, or animistic. If you don't know those words, don't make any difference. It doesn't matter what kind of religion you're talking about. Regardless of the nature of the religion, all religions hold these truths in common. Therefore, Kellogg concludes that these beliefs must be instinctual within man, corresponding to the spiritual realities of the unseen world. In other words, we could think about it like this. We get thirsty because we need something to drink. We get hungry because we need something to eat. But there is something to drink. There is something to eat. In the same way, these instinctual beliefs must correspond with reality. Kellogg argues if they did not, it would be the only time within the animal kingdom where an instinct or appetite universal to the species does not point to something in the environment that corresponds to it. Now, this raises two questions. First, why are human beings universally religious with a common set of doctrines? Now, the answer is one of two. Either these truths within this belief system are self-evident, or Kellogg is wrong. Those are the only two ways that you can approach that question. His second question is this: how should the Christian apologist respond to this basic universal religious system? And the answer, of course, to this question depends on how you answer the first question. Now, if these truths really are self-evident, then the Christian apologist can confidently appeal to truths already known by the unbeliever. Specifically, if all people already know there is a God, then there is no necessity to prove his existence through the use of evidence and reason. If the truth of God's existence is not self-evident, then this truth must be proved through evidence or reason. So this really is an important question because it reflects how we as believers should approach the non-believer, particularly when they claim to not believe in the existence of God. That leads us to Romans 1:18 through 21. And we're going to take this verse by verse. Romans 1:18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. I see several of you grabbing your Bibles. That's excellent. If you have your Bible with you, please do so. If you don't, look it up on your computer or your phone. If you don't have that, well, pay attention. All right. The key word here in this verse is katexanton, the word meaning suppress, to suppress. And there's two possible definitions to this Greek word. One is to hold back or to prevent from going away. The other is to hold down or suppress something. So if we were to plug in these two definitions into the text, we would read that the Gentiles had not kept the deposit of truth given to them. That is, they'd allowed the deposit of truth to slip away so that they no longer possess it, or the Gentiles hold down the deposit of truth given to them so that they still possess it, but it doesn't come to the surface. The majority of lexicons and commentators favor the second option. Louw-Nida, for example, defines this word as to prevent someone from doing something by restraining or hindering. I like the way the great Greek scholar of the previous century, A.T. Robertson, put it. Truth is out in the open, but wicked men, so to speak, put it in a box and sit on the lid and hold it down in unrighteousness. Okay? Romans 1:19, let's continue. Since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain. And here the key phrase is what may be known about God. What may be known about God. And much of Paul's argument in this chapter rests on the phrase, what may be known about God, for the content of this expression explains what truth is being suppressed or hindered, and it acquits God from the charge of condemning the innocent. We've all heard this before. How can a righteous God condemn all those poor innocent people in Lower Bongo someplace that have never heard the gospel? Well, this defends God from that charge, and we'll see how that happens in a moment. Now, what may be known about God? Well, there's two possible definitions on the meaning of this genitive phrase. The natural man really knows God. That is, the truth of his existence and some measure of his nature. He really knows that. Or, the natural man merely has the ability to know God. That is, that man has suppressed the evidence for what potentially may be known about God. Now, unlike verse 18, commentators and translations are divided upon which option is correct. Lexicons aren't of any help here at all, because what we're talking about is a point of grammar, not a point of definition. We can see this divide if we look at some basic translations. The New American Standard 1995 translate, because what is known about God, or that which is known about God, is evident within them because God has made it evident within them. Darby's translation of 1890 also follows this one. The NIV and the King James 1900 translate it, since what may be known about God, its potential. Along with the NIV and KJV is the New King James, the English Standard Version, and the Lexham Bible, if you have that, Lexham English Bible. Now, the reason people are all over the place on this is because the phrase by itself is ambiguous. An example of an ambiguous phrase, I fought with Bob. Well, I can mean I fought against Bob. I fought with Bob. Or it can mean I fought alongside Bob. I fought with Bob, you see? And the only difference between those two is the inflection of my voice. Only the larger context determines what's appropriate. By the way, it's this kind of ambiguity that's been the source of jokes for years. My father fought with the 10th Marine and the 5th Cavalry and the 10th Infantry. He couldn't get along with anyone. You see, it's that ambiguousness that causes the joke, okay? Now, why would God write something ambiguous? Well, ambiguity is an important part of language, allowing us to keep our vocabulary within manageable proportions. The largest, the word with the largest number of definitions in the English language is the word set, S-E-T. It has 22 different definitions. So we don't have to learn 22 different words. We just use one word, and then we use it in a variety of situations depending on what we want to do with it. It helps us keep our vocabulary down. Ambiguity also seems most likely to appear in common expressions. The word set is certainly a common word. Therefore, the more common the construction, the greater likelihood of ambiguity. So I know the burning question in your mind at this particular moment. How common was it to use an articular substantival adjective followed by a genitive? I know that's what you're asking. Well, before a riot begins, let me answer that. It's super common, which in itself is a technical term meaning it's used a lot, okay? Now, the mere fact of an ambiguous phrase does not preclude, however, an accurate interpretation. Just because it's ambiguous doesn't mean we can't know what it means. Ambiguity is seldom a problem in communication because the context almost always excludes irrelevant meanings. When I use the phrase, I fought with Bob, you're waiting for another sentence to let me know exactly how to take the word with, and it's almost always supplied, isn't it? In other words, the proper meaning for this phrase should be taken from the range of options available so it best fits the context. So what are our range of options? Well, it could be knowledge concerning God, or what can be known or is known about God, or God in his knowability. All of these are legitimate options. Now, I will say, of the 15 New Testament occurrences of the adjective gnostos, this is the only reference that can possibly refer to knowability or potential knowledge. While the subject of the sentence might be ambiguous, the direct object is relatively straightforward. Phaneros, translated, is plain, or is evident, or is manifest. The primary reference is to what is visible to sensory perception. When it's linked to a me, is, in this passage, it refers to what can be perceived by the senses in such a way that the person or that the perception involves understanding. Lau and Knight explain it like this. All of these meanings involved a shift, watch, from the sensory domain of seeing, causing to see or give light to the cognitive domain, the thinking domain of making something fully known, evident, or clear. In other words, we see something, and then it is gone from that idea of seeing to an idea in the mind making clear what it is that we have seen. Okay? Now, the reason this knowledge of God is so clear is supplied by the rest of the verse, because God has made it plain to them. God himself is the active agent pressing home the reality of his existence. In other words, it's not a matter of if people see and understand. They do see and understand because God is actively involved to make sure that they understand, according to the text. In other words, there's no chance that people can miss God's revelation of himself because he is the active agent making his revelation fully known, evident, and clear. The implication of the verse, then, is that the content of ta gnoston to theou is clearly known and understood through sensory perception. So verse 19 can legitimately be translated one of two ways. We can say, what is known about God is understood, or the potential for knowing God is understood. But in either case, and this is important, the necessary assumption for either of these translations is that people in question understand that there is a God to be known. People understand that there is a God to be known. We'll move on to verse 20. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that men are without excuse. Let's look first at the phrase, his invisible attributes. For his invisible attributes. In this sentence, the word for acts as a linking word, indicating that additional information is being given about what is described. So, the phrase, ta aorata autu, his invisible qualities, stand in opposition to ta gnoston to theou, what may be known about God, and aletheon, truth, in 118. They stand in opposition. Now, what do we mean by opposition? It's a relationship between two or more words or phrases in which the two units are grammatically parallel and have the same referent. Well, that's kind of confusing, but we use it all the time. Here's an example. The first president of the United States, George Washington. Those two phrases are in opposition. When we talk about the first president of the United States, we're talking about George Washington. When we're talking about George Washington, we're talking about the first president of the United States. In other words, they're two different phrases, but they're talking about the same thing. So what that means is the truth in 118 is the same as that which is known about God in 119, which is the same as his invisible attributes in 120. They're all talking about the same thing. The truth is that which is known about God, which is his invisible attributes. They're all the same. In Paul's explanation of these general terms, he uses vocabulary common to Greek philosophy. The idea of an invisible realm that cannot be experienced through sensory perception was a well-known Stoic idea. The Stoics taught that this invisible realm was only knowable through the reasoning faculties of the mind. It was through the Jewish philosopher Philo that this Greek concept entered Jewish thought. In fact, Philo used aorata over 100 times. So both the Gentiles and Jews in Rome would have understood the philosophical connotations of these words. Put it another way, the philosophical foundation that is associated with these words is important. The average reader of this epistle would have assumed this context. Namely, this is what they would have assumed, that there is an invisible realm that is nevertheless knowable through the rational powers of the mind. There is an invisible realm that is knowable through the rational powers of the mind. So, what then is the content of these invisible qualities? Paul answers this question by employing another appositional phrase. In other words, Paul uses another phrase to define truth, that which is known about God, and invisible qualities. We're going to expand on it more. We're going to get more information about the same thing we've already been talking about. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. The key phrase here is his eternal power and divine nature. The phrase, his eternal power, teaches at least three attributes of God are immediately self-evident. The invisible God is personal, eternal, and powerful. His eternal power shows his eternality. His eternal power shows his power. I know it's obvious, but we're going to state the obvious anyway. His eternal power, the use of the personal pronoun, shows his personality. In other words, he's not like electricity or gravity. He is not a force. He is a person. It's not its eternal power, but his eternal power. He's a person. The next self-evident truth refers to God's divine nature. It's more difficult to define this word because it's what's known as a hapax legomenon, meaning that it's spoken only once. It's only used here in the extant Greek manuscripts, the Greek manuscripts we still have. So this is a word only used once. By the way, the most famous hapax legomena of the New Testament is found in the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. Pretty sure that's what it means. But that's the only time it's ever used, but we're pretty sure. So we shouldn't be afraid just because a word's only used once, but we do have to recognize that that makes definition a little more difficult. Okay? Because this is only used once, of course, a variety of definitions have been proposed. Moulton and Milligan state that the word was used with reference to the priestly duties of the temple, and therefore he translates it as his divine majesty. Lau and Nida define this word as the nature and state of being God. Some other proposed definitions, just what God is like, or how God is, or what God is, or the fact that God is, or the fact that he is God or is truly God. Well, how do we determine then what this means? Let's talk about the rule of maximal redundancy. Martin Jews, addressing the problem of hapax legomenon, postulated the rule of maximum redundancy, which states that the best meaning is the least meaning. In other words, if we can get it to contribute the least amount of information to the text, we're probably interpreting it correctly. A hapax should be defined to make it contribute least to the total message derivable from the passage where it's at home. This leads to the principle that the overall meaning of the passage should not depend solely on a single word, but should be derived from the entire passage. Think about language with me for a moment. Language is very redundant. Language loves redundancy. If I'm speaking with you and someone comes by in a Harley with no pipes on it and roars by and you miss a word or two, usually you still get the main idea of whatever I'm talking about. Because just missing a word or two doesn't mean that you don't get the entire context. And in language, we constantly are saying the same things in different ways over and over again, so that if you miss a word, you still get the entire context. Okay? That's what we're looking at here. Even if we're not quite sure what this word means, we get the general context. Language is redundant, and so therefore language is still understandable. Okay? In this particular case, the least meaning would state the fact that he is God. So let's review Paul's argument up to this point. The truth, verse 18, that is, what may be known about God, verse 19, that is, his invisible qualities, verse 20, that is, namely, that he exists and that he is personal, eternal, and powerful, are fully known, evident, and clear because God is the active agent making it clear. If you haven't followed some of it up until now, that's fine. If you get this, you've got it. The truth, what may be known about God, his invisible qualities, all talking about the same thing, that he exists, that he's personal, eternal, and powerful, are fully known, evident, and clear because God is the active agent making it clear. Let's keep looking at 1:20. Robbie, what time am I supposed to quit? You handed me a calendar. I didn't know what that meant, so what? 9:50. Oh, we're in good shape. And it's nice to remember at this particular point that, yeah? Right. Gotcha. You know, the good thing is that if I finish early, no pastor was ever hung for quitting early. So just something that I always remember. Okay. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that men are without excuse. The phrase we're looking at is, since the creation of the world, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made. The first part of this phrase, from the creation of the world, is ambiguous. It could be translated to show temporal origin, from the beginning of the creation, or it could be used to indicate source, from the source of creation. The context in this particular case is of little help. Both options fit nicely into the flow of thought and are equally true. But here's something more important. What do we do with understood versus clearly seen? What's the relationship of noumena, being understood, and katharatai, clearly seen? If the verb katharatai is only found here in the New Testament, but it's common in the Septuagint, that's what that LXX means, the Septuagint and extra-biblical sources. This word, clearly seen, refers to the invisible, which is perceived in the external and visible. Now, that's kind of a contradiction. It's talking about the invisible, God, which can be seen through things that are visible. We can think of it this way. We have electric lights in here. Okay? Electricity is invisible, but its nature, its source, can be clearly seen from what we do have in here, electric lights. In the same way, God, who is invisible, can be clearly seen through what is around us. That's the point. In contrast to the physical act of seeing, the participle noumena means to comprehend something on the basis of careful thought and consideration. It has the idea of thoughtful reflection upon what is seen. Now, this is important that we understand these two words, and here's why. It's the combination of these two verbs that suggests the action of seeing with the eye and understanding with the mind. Thus, the King James Version, New American Standard, and NIV translate this phrase, clearly seen, being understood. Now, both words are necessary. If Paul had only used katharatai, clearly seen, the phrase would have been ambiguous. One could have argued that the reality and nature of God may be seen with the eye, but not understood with the mind. I see it, but I don't know what I'm looking at. On the other hand, if Paul had only written noumena, being understood, he would have left the interpretive door open to the Hellenistic notion that the revelation of God is completely internal and mystical. It's completely divorced from outward evidence. It's something that we know in our hearts, but there is no evidence for. But by combining these two verbs, Paul communicates a combination of these two ideas. Specifically, Paul teaches that the knowledge of God occurs through the combination of physical sensation and internal reflection. The knowledge of God occurs through the combination of physical sensation and internal reflection. In other words, people see the evidence with the eye and understand the evidence with the heart. And remember, we know this happens because God is making it plain to them. God is the active agent, assuring that this takes place. Now, the clarity of this expression is also indirectly attested by the phrase, so that they are without excuse. For it's on the basis of knowledge that is clearly seen and understood that God considers every person morally culpable. The critics who charge that God condemns the innocent when he punishes those who have not heard would be correct if God found guilty those that had no knowledge of his existence. But God, being just, reveals himself in nature, being an active agent to ensure the clarity of that revelation. It's only on the basis of mankind's rejection of that revelation that God condemns humanity. Why does God condemn humanity? Because the fact that he's eternal, that he's powerful, and that he is personal is clearly seen through the creation. It is understood with the heart because God is actively ensuring that it is understood by the heart, but man is suppressing that knowledge. He's putting it in a box and sitting on the lid so that it can't get out. That's the message of this text. Verse 21, once more. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but became futile or empty in their speculations, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Here the key phrase is, for even though they knew God. Please notice this is the fifth time in this passage that the text tells us that people know God. Okay? The phrase, for even though they knew God, links the previous argument concerning man's rejection of God with the resulting list of judgments that follow. Why is it that mankind is condemned? Because they know God and reject him. And on that basis, they are condemned. Now, let's do a summary of what we've learned here. Paul makes four statements concerning the revelation and knowability of God. First, all people everywhere acquire a rudimentary knowledge of God as creator. Second, knowledge of God as creator is acquired by rational reflection on the created order. Third, the sinful heart consistently suppresses this knowledge derived from nature. Fourth, mankind's deliberate rejection of this revelation establishes his guilt before God. That's Paul's general argument. Let's draw some specific conclusions. Mankind is continually suppressing the truth. That is, what is known about God. That is, his invisible qualities. The fact that he is and is eternally powerful. The fact that God is and that he is eternally powerful is understood through what has been made. People see with the eyes the invisible qualities of God through the visible creation and rationally process the information to arrive at an understanding. God ensures that this information is clear to them. Mankind is not a neutral observer to God's revelation. Although people really do know God, they suppress this truth in an unrighteous manner so that they are defenseless before the bar of God's justice. Since the knowledge of God is constantly poured out through the created order, right now the created order is displaying this knowledge. The evidence for God's existence, power, eternality, and personality are always present. It's always being declared. Just as the knowledge of God is constantly being poured out, man's suppression of that knowledge is equally consistent. By the way, this idea of putting it in a box and sitting on it and closing the lid and sitting on it is helpful, but it's not the best illustration. What I really love about cruise control is the fact that the decision to obey the speed limit only needs to be made once. Okay? It's not a continual moment-by-moment decision, because that's hard. All I got to do is press it to 55 when everybody else is going 70, and then constantly pray that I'll make it home. In the same way, this idea, though, of taking the knowledge of God and putting it in a box and sitting on it implies that you only make that decision once. That's not the way it is. We just got a new puppy. Thank you. No, please, remain seated. As insane as it sounds, we got a Great Dane puppy. Why, yes. No, he's not full grown yet. Yes, I am out of my mind. Now, the fact about puppies, if you have puppies and you put them in a box, what are they going to try and do? Get out. They're going to try and crawl out of the box. If you want to keep them in the box, what do you have to do? You have to constantly be pushing the puppies back down into the box, right? That's the way it is with mankind and its suppression of the truth. It's not that you close the lid and you sit on it and you're done. You have to constantly be pressing the puppies back down in the box, because God's revelation of himself is constantly trying to get out of the box. Okay? So, the sinner's moral culpability implies that this is an actual knowledge that is suppressed. Now, how does this apply to apologetics? Because that's really what we're talking about, isn't it? Some of you are saying, I have no idea what we're talking about. Let's look at the traditional approach. By traditional, I'm referring to the evidentialist approach and the experimentalist approach to apologetics. They are different, but they would agree on this one thing. The evidentialist says we have to use evidence. The experimentalist would say we know God exists because of what he's done in our hearts. Okay? Mullins, who's an experimentalist, typifies the traditional approach to the question of the existence of God. He writes this: we are not to assume forthwith that God exists and that he is a person. We can't assume that in our apologetic interactions. The traditional approach believes that the unbeliever should not be asked to accept the truth of God's evidence without the proof of God's existence without proper evidence. Thus, the traditional apologist will walk the unbeliever through various proofs of God's existence in order to show the rationality of such a belief. And there are some traditional arguments for the existence of God, the cosmological and the teleological and so forth, that are standard, and the more you climb into the more involved they become. But we need these arguments because we can't expect people to just assume that God exists. In contrast, the presuppositional argument can be reduced to two basic assertions. Human beings are obliged to presuppose God in all their thinking. Unbelievers resist this obligation in every aspect of thought and life. Put another way, the unbeliever already knows the existence not just of a God, but the Christian God. Evidences are used, therefore, not to prove the reality of God, but merely to bring to the consciousness what the unbeliever already knows to be true. What separates these points of view, traditional versus presuppositional, is the question of the rationality of the belief in God apart from evidence, or at least, let's put it this way, apart from logical evidence. The traditional apologist argues that the theistic proofs are necessary to avoid fideism. Fideism is the idea that faith is independent of reason and superior to it. Fideism is belief without evidence. I believe something merely because I believe it. That's fideism. We're not going there. I heard that, and we're not going there. All right? Oh, Lord, I have labored in vain. Okay. A summary of this position is this. Unless a proposition is either fundamental to knowledge based on evidence, one is not rationally justified in believing the truth of that presupposition. This is Francis Beckworth, by the way, who says this. Unless a proposition is either fundamental to knowledge or based on evidence, one is not rationally justified in believing the truth of that proposition. But even by Beckworth's standards, presuppositionalism is not fideism. According to Beckworth, fundamental to knowledge, remember he said it's either fundamental to knowledge or backed by evidence. Fundamental to knowledge, according to him, are those propositions that are properly basic. Properly basic propositions are those which are self-evident and incorrigible. An example of a self-evident proposition is a circle is round. That's self-evident. That's definition. Don't need to prove that. An incorrigible truth is one that can't be corrected, such as the statement, I am in pain. Since no one but the person speaking can testify to the reality of the pain, the statement cannot be doubted, even though it's not logically necessary. This is why that stupid question, I'm going to offend any healthcare professionals in here, but people ask me what I do for a living anymore. I tell them I go to the doctor, okay? The stupid question, are you in pain? Yes. Rate your pain from 1 to 10. That's idiotic. My 10 might be your 2, because you look like a tough guy, and I'm a fragile little flower, all right? I mean, that's just... So it's stupid, but... I digress. I feel better now that I got that out, all right? It's incorrigible because nobody can go inside you and tell you what you feel. This is why, by the way, when somebody tells you that they've had this charismatic experience, you can't tell them, no, you didn't, because they had an experience. You might tell them, I don't think you're interpreting that experience correctly. You can say that. But you can't tell somebody they didn't have an experience when they did. That kind of statement is incorrigible. So, when the biblical data concerning the universal knowledge of God is examined, it becomes clear that the Scriptures consider the statement, the eternally powerful Christian God exists, to be foundation to knowledge, and therefore should be rationally accepted without evidence. Why? Because it's self-evident. Fideism relies on non-verifiable faith apart from evidence. In contrast, presuppositionalists embrace the evidence that God's creation provides. The fact that every person clearly understands God's revelation of himself in nature is confirmation that the knowledge of God is self-evident. Likewise, this knowledge is understood internally within every individual. Thus, it can be properly considered incorrigible, since this internal knowledge cannot be completely extinguished despite the best efforts of the unbeliever. Now, does that mean faith isn't important? Not at all. Hebrews 11:6 confirms the necessity of faith. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. It's not unlikely. It's not more difficult. It's impossible. Without the shedding of blood, it's impossible. There's no remission of sins. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and, listen, that he is a rewarder of those that diligently seek him. Lots of us believe that God is. A hard time for many of us is that we don't really believe that God is a rewarder of those that diligently seek him. If I step out in faith, God's going to hang me out to dry. Okay? Faith is important. But faith required here is not opposed or apart from evidence. Instead, the faith that halts the consistent suppression of truth and bows the will to God that is known by all. That's what faith does. Faith stops the suppression of the truth and bows the will to God that they already know. So, conclusion. This investigation began by asking two questions. Why are human beings universally religious with a common set of doctrines? How should the Christian apologist respond to this basic universal religious system? We've discovered that people are universally religious because people universally recognize the truth of God's existence. The fact that he is and that he is personal and eternally powerful is, in fact, foundational to knowledge. So how should the Christian apologist respond to this basic universal religious system? Cornelius Van Til wrote the most on this, and his answer is best. He wrote, quote, "The natural man at bottom knows that he's a creature of God. He knows also that he's responsible to God. He knows that he should live to the glory of God. He knows that in all that he does, he should stress that the field of reality which he investigates has the stamp of God's ownership upon it. But he suppresses his knowledge of himself as he truly is. He is the man with the iron mask. A true method of apologetics must seek to tear off that iron mask." Now, at this point, I will entertain any questions that you may have. None? Good. Thank you for coming. Where's Robbie? He's usually, you're gonna MC? Great.
Questions?
I'm afraid I'm going to ask a dumb question.
My dear, there is no such thing. Well, there are such things as dumb questions. And the reason I know that is because I've always been accused of being an inquisitive idiot. But you know something? I bet that yours isn't. Go ahead.
Your premise is that we see nature.
Mm-hmm.
And I assisted a blind woman into the room this morning. What if you can't see nature?
That's an excellent question, and I appreciate you asking that. Because the idea of seeing here is, I don't want to say it's a figure of speech, but it's all-encompassing. In other words, we all experience nature through our five senses, okay? So whether we see or not is not important. We have five senses. We can taste, we can touch, we can hear, we can smell, we can see. And the idea here of seeing is just, what is that figure of speech where a portion is for the whole? Andy, you know what I'm talking about. What's that called? That's not... Metonymy. That was clear. It's a metonymy. It's where you just use one. I'm not sure that's right. Anyway, you just use one.
Metonymy or synecdoche.
Synecdoche, which is even clearer. All right. Good. God, it's a synecdoche, dear. Next question. A synecdoche is where you use just a part of something for the whole, okay? So here, seeing is used for the entire five senses. The entire five senses experience God's creation. And then through logic or reason, we reason that this must come from the Creator God. And we always arrive at that conclusion because God makes it evident within the heart. Okay? That was an excellent question, by the way. So did I answer it for you? Yes. Okay, good. Good. Anybody else have any questions about that?
I have a question on
wait a minute. This young man was next. I want to...
Go right ahead. Stand, please. Stand.
The atheist insists that he has no evidence for God, and he can't believe even that he wants to believe. There are many that I've spoken with, that they begged and pleaded God to make himself evident to them, and they have silence. Mm-hmm. And are they lying?
You betcha.
Oh, okay.
That's exactly what they're doing. Here's the way I always answer well, first of all, please notice that to become an atheist, you got to go to college. No, for once I'm not making a joke. Nobody is naturally an atheist. You have to study to become I always call them practicing atheists, because I don't believe that atheism exists, not in its true form. What I always tell them is this, and it might work for you and it might not, but it has always worked for me. If you told me that I just don't believe that God exists, I always look at them and smile. You could say anything with a smile on your face, just about. always look at them and smile. And then I say, oh, you believe that God exists. When you lie down on your bed and you put your head on your pillow and the party's over and you're all alone there with your thoughts, you know that God exists. You just don't like what you know, and so you pretend it's not true. Okay? That's what I always say. And I've never seen it fail yet. There's always this moment of the deer in the headlights look, where their dirty little secret has been let out. Just for a second, you got to look close. But then they'll go, oh, that's not true, and they'll deny it. But if I believe the Bible, I know they're lying. In other words, if I accept what they're saying as true, I'm denying the very faith I'm defending. Because the Bible is quite clear, they do know about God. They know at least 4 things about God. They know that he is, that he exists, that he's eternal, that he's powerful, and that he's personal. They know that. And so I assume that they know that and act upon that assumption. Okay? Did I answer your question, sir? Okay. Anybody else other than Robbie, you had a question?
Anybody over here have a question?
Being that God is the one who reveals himself, is there a danger sometimes that we lose the wrong argument, that where we spend a lot of time trying to convince someone who's obviously rejecting the truth and forget to witness in regard to Christ? Kind of lose the wrong argument, as it were.
Okay, let me state back to you what I think your question is. I'm not trying to comment on it. I'm just trying to restate it to make sure I'm understanding it. That we spend so much time trying to prove the existence of God that we don't focus on Christ and the cross, and that would be a mistake. Is that what you're asking?
Right.
Okay. That varies from situation to situation. But I would say that if we don't get to Christ and the cross, it's irrelevant. I would say that the only okay, let me try it like this. Do you have children?
Yes, I do.
How old are they?
They are about 30, 27.
Yeah! Hey, I am not criticizing. If my wife was here and she'd go, how old are your children? Well, the oldest is 36, hon? Is that right? I would have done the exact same thing. All right. So remember when they were young, and they were 8, 9, okay? And you said, you can't eat all your birthday candy because it'll spoil your supper. First words out of their mouth were, no, it won't, right? And there would be no way to reason with your child that what they're saying is obviously irrational. If you don't go to bed tonight, you're not going to be able to get up tomorrow morning. Yes, I will. Why? Because the mind always follows the will. What the will determines to be true, the mind will come up with rational reasons defending what the will has already decided. Therefore, when we engage in an apologetic encounter, our goal is always to attack the will. Now, we can do that through stripping away the defenses of the mind from time to time. Okay? So that's not a useless effort. But we have to remember that it is always the will that is the problem. People are sinful because they choose to be sinful. They don't believe in God because they choose not to believe in God. They reject Christ because they choose to reject Christ. That's why. So we must get there sooner or later to the cross. And we also remember that when we're in an apologetic encounter, we're never there alone. Because God, the Holy Spirit, is pressing the truths of the gospel home to that individual as you're speaking. Whether they drop on their knees right now and confess Christ or not is beside the point. God, the Holy Spirit, is there and is involved and active. Okay? So you're right, we have to do that. But I don't think it's an either or, I think it's a both and, as far as looking at apologetic encounters. Okay? There's a hand. This young lady, I think, was next, and then there's a hand over there. Over here, yes. This young lady in the pretty blue shawl there. Oh, okay. Yes.
Well, I didn't have a question. I have more of a comment. I had an opportunity to lead a Muslim to the Lord, and the two things that he said to me after I asked him, would you like to receive Christ as your Savior and know that you will have eternal life? And he said, yes, I think I would. And then he told me the two things that I'll never forget was, I feel really different now. And then he says, no one has ever asked me before.
There you go. That's right. And thank you, because that just goes back again to, I think, what this gentleman's question was. People get so involved saying, don't you realize this, and this truth, this, and this truth, and never pressing home to the will. I had an advertising executive say one time, if you can't ask for money, you can't sell insurance. If you can't ask for money, you can't sell insurance. If you can't bring people to the cross, you can't lead people to Christ. So that's excellent. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that very, very much. Yes, sir. Over here.
Pat.
Yes. Could you comment a little bit? I've been in situations with coworkers where it was clear that they were suppressing the truth, and I thought, well, the Holy Spirit's the one that's got to convict them. So I didn't try to argue these things. Could you make some comments about where, when it's appropriate to try to argue for God's existence and when it's not, when the Spirit has to do the convicting?
I've found, and now please be aware that there's sometimes I can state with assurance, thus saith the Lord. And there's other times when I say, my experience has been. This is my experience has been, okay? But my experience has been that if you let people know that you're a believer, and you make no secrets about it, you don't lower your voice at work when you talk about Christ as if you're telling a secret, that sooner or later people will come to you. I remember when I was working my way through seminary, I worked at Hallmark Cards as a computer consultant, and I was getting ready to leave my little cubicle, and this guy comes up and he goes, "Hey, Bruce," he starts looking around, make sure nobody's there to catch him. "I know you're religious." And that was good, because I was going to seminary, and he knew that, so I'm glad he realized that I was. And he said, "Well, and then he asked me about a personal problem. And I was able through that to say, what the real problem here is. You're not going to like my answer, but the real problem here is sin. And it's here and here, and here's what you need to do about it." And took him to the cross. Now, whether he did anything with that or not, I rarely saw this guy, I don't know. But he knew he came to me, okay? I think that occasionally just the right word at the right time, nobody ever wins arguments. Nobody ever changes the will through an argument, okay? So that's not there. But the constant and consistent defense of Christ, just saying, well, I know that he exists and you do too, that'll go a long way, I think. Okay, anybody else have any questions?
No, I want to add something to what you said.
Yeah.
One of the things that I have been trying to learn over the years is not to tell them what they need to do, but to ask them a question that if they think about it, it will bring them to reflect in their life and thinking. Because like Bruce just said, you can't just say, okay, this is what you need to do. This is what it says. You need to say, well, have you thought about this? You're making this conclusion, you're saying this, well, have you thought about that? Or some other way of getting them to expose the fact that they are not living consistently with whatever it is that they say they believe. And asking questions it makes it a long process, and I find that for some of us who have impatience is part of their strong suit of their sin nature, that we want to.
You've gotten into meddling now, so I want you to know that.
We want to hurry up the process because we want to tell them the right answer. And that often, that's where we have to, we need to try to avoid getting into an argument and going, this is what you say and then this is what I say. That's not the point, is to prove that we're right. The point is to expose the flaws in their thinking that God the Holy Spirit can exploit. Does that help? Okay, Drew, back here.
Question about agreed there's a universal knowledge of God. Nobody's born an atheist. Is there a pull to find out, based on the 4 points of religion that you had, they know they have sinned? All of creation knows it's sin. Is there a pull to find a solution to that sin problem? And is that where those that really want to find it end up searching for Christ and he connects the dots to them? How do you take that next step into the need to believe in his Son for salvation?
Well, yes and no is my answer to your question, because you really asked two questions. Is there a pull to find a solution to the sin problem? The answer is yes. That's why you have so many different religions, so many different approaches to God. People don't like what they know about God, so they create a God that they like better. Whether it's Buddhism, Hinduism, whether it's Islam, whether it's, it doesn't matter. There is something there. The reason people are universally religious is they know that there is a God, and that between them and God something is wrong, and so they try and find a solution to it. That's what religion does. So yeah, they do. People today, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. Well, why are you spiritual? Because they know there is a God to be known. But they don't like the God, so they try and find something else. But if there was a God to be known that didn't make any difference to their lives, then why would they bother to try and know him? So yes, the answer is to find something. The problem is, because our sin nature is so ingrained in us that it does not automatically pull them to Christ. Because the sin nature that is the problem is so entrenched, when they hear about Christ, they automatically rebel because they've rejected that. They've rejected the one true God, therefore they will reject the ultimate expression in human form, that one true God, Jesus Christ. Okay? And it's only when the other attempts at assuaging that sin problem have proven futile that they will come to Christ. Okay? I saw another hand. Yes?
And thank you again. And
you're the first one to say thank you, so I appreciate that.
Well,
the rest of you ungrateful. All right. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I don't want to make everyone else seem ungrateful.
I didn't say that out loud, did I? All right. Go ahead.
At the beginning, did you state? I'm trying to get clarification. Did you state that this was to the Gentile? Was this to the Jew? Was this to the human race in general?
What Paul is writing here?
Yes.
Paul is writing, in Romans 1:18 is where the argument of the book starts, through chapter 3, verse 20, Paul is making the case that all people are guilty before God. He's declaring his gospel. He wants to go to Spain.
Right.
And he needs help to get there. But the problem in Rome at this particular time was that Rome, through a number of political reasons and other things, was divided into two churches. There was a Gentile church and there was a Jewish church. It's a lot like the United States. Dr. Martin Luther King was right when he said that the most segregated time in America is 11 o'clock Sunday morning. You got a black church, you got a white church. Occasionally there's mixture, not real often. So that was the case in Rome. You had a Gentile church, you had a Jewish church. Occasionally they mixed, not real often. They didn't hate one another, but they didn't trust one another either. And so Paul wrote his book of Romans to bring together these two churches and show them that they were all the same, that the answer was Christ, and that was the whole purpose of the book. Okay, now, in Romans 1:18 through the end of the chapter, until you get to chapter 2, he's talking to the Gentiles. Chapter 2, he starts a new argument. It's called a diatribe. where you assume an invisible opponent. Now, some will say this, okay? And then he picks up in verse 17, if you're a Jew, and then he points the finger right at him, okay? But the whole argument of that section is to make everyone guilty. The Jews knew about God, so this particular part is not necessarily pointed at the Jews, because they accepted the revelation of God in the law. What they didn't accept was the revelation of God in Jesus Christ. Okay? So this idea about not accepting God or changing him, etc., that wasn't necessarily applied to the Jew. This is talking about people that haven't accepted anything true about God. Okay? But it's true of everyone who hasn't come to Jesus Christ. I don't know if I'm being clear or not. Am I helping here at all?
I'll just, not a point of contention, but even within the Jewish history and the Hebrew history in the Old Testament, they often suppressed the knowledge and truth of God through the worship of the creation rather than the Creator.
Oh, certainly. Until the Babylonian captivity, there was always idolatry from the time they left Egypt all the way to the Babylonian captivity. The Babylonian captivity cured them. They never went into idolatry again. Now, they had other problems, but they never went into idolatry. But you're absolutely right. Even at the time of David, there was still idolatry going on. It was suppressed and outlawed, but it was still there. So you're right. They did that. So this is talking about people universally. Some people move further along. I mean, some people move farther along than others. They might accept the existence of God. They might accept the existence of the God of the Bible, but then add all kinds of works to their salvation, okay? But this is talking about people generally who are rejecting God and changing him into something else. Okay? Are we out of time, or we got one more here?
Okay, and I'll have my question, so.
Oh, goody.
Bruce, since you're so expressive and thoughtful, how is your medical...
I'm sorry. That wasn't meant to be funny, was it? Okay, go ahead.
How has your medical diagnosis affected that?
In 2014, I was teaching in Africa, which I did every year, and I noticed that I started to fall. And I blamed it on being tired. I'm not as young as I used to be. The steps are never... was usually when I was walking up steps. The steps are never even like they are here, and I came up with a dozen excuses. Then at Christmas, my brother-in-law, who had Parkinson's, but I didn't know it, noticed that my hands were shaking. And then I began to notice that the hardest thing I did every week was get dressed on Sunday morning. So I went to the doctor. The doctor says, you either have this one type of disease, multifocal motor neuropathy, which is curable and treatable and so forth, or you have ALS and your life expectancy is 2 to 3 years and we can't treat it. He determined that I had multifocal motor neuropathy and we began to treat that. But I began to get worse quicker than that. So they sent me to Mayo. Mayo said, if I was to take your test results and just hand them to an intern, they'd say you have ALS. But your case history suggests otherwise, so I'm 80% certain that you have some other disease. We're going to put it in this family of diseases called chronic inflammatory demyelinating polyneuropathy. And yes, I did have to practice to say it that fast. But we can't take ALS off the table. This last August, because I was getting worse and worse, my doctor said, this is very rare, but we believe you have 2 diseases. We believe that you have some lower motor neuron disease like CIDP, but we also believe you have ALS. And I said, what's the prognosis? He told me last August, he said, we're pretty sure you'll live 6 months. You could live a year, 18 months at the outside. Now, doctors aren't perfect. They're not omniscient. They don't know everything. Jesus said, I hold the keys to hell and death. And until Jesus puts that key in the door, there is nothing that can kill us. But when he does put that key in the door, no team of doctors, no matter how skilled, can save us. Right? So I said, okay. And since that time, I've had the opportunity to witness to dozens and dozens and dozens of health professionals. Now, I asked them, am I getting sick as quick as you thought I would? And he said, no, you're getting sick much slower than we thought you would. So that's why I bought a dog. Okay, I figure I might live it to see it out of the puppy stage, you know? So I don't know what the future holds. I do know this, that God has given me extraordinary grace, and that because of that, I've been told I'm different than the other ALS patients. Other ALS patients are oftentimes desperate and bitter. I talked to one man, said he couldn't get up and go to the bathroom in the middle of the night with going to the computer and checking to see if there was anything new on ALS. And so people have asked me, why are you cheerful? And that gives, well, other than I just have a sparkling personality anyway. Deny it if you dare. I'm able to say, look, I know that when I die, I'm going to be with Christ. Amen. And if I really believe what I've been preaching all these years about how it's joy inexpressible and full of glory, that the glory of heaven is God himself. It is the beatific vision. It is to be in the presence of the one who is the sum of all perfections. If you really believe that, then it changes the way you look at terminal diseases. Okay? Now, I have my days. Okay? But most of the time, particularly when I go to the doctor, this has been a witnessing opportunity unlike any I've ever seen. So, there's blessing involved in it. Even not all things are good. We have to admit that. But God uses all things for good. And so we just trust that. Okay, so I hope I've answered your question. Robbie, you had a question?
This is a yes or no question.
I bet.
Because if the answer is yes, we'll have a discussion about it later on because it's not for here. But the yes or no question is, have you taken the conclusions from Romans 1:18 to 21 and related those to the the ontological argument as expressed by Anselm in the Proslogian, or Aquinas in his critique of the per se notum argument for the existence of God, per se notum meaning self-evident?
That's a good question. I'm glad you've asked that question, and that's what makes America great, that we can ask questions, important questions like that, and that's why a vote for Baker is a vote for better government. Yes, I have, but not those arguments specifically. I think that all of the logical arguments for God, except possibly the transcendental argument, are futile. I think that they will inevitably take you down rabbit hole after rabbit hole after rabbit hole, and there's no way to reason your way out of them.
Would you say it's because of the presupposition behind the structure of the argument? Because we believe Romans 1:18 to 21 expresses a per se notum argument for the existence of God, but it's not the way it's structured by any of the philosophers, and that's because of the presupposition of their approach.
Well, I think that's true, but I think the real problem is the sinfulness of man. Because no matter what argument you come up with, there's going to be one more argument on why whatever you've said is irrelevant. And you will never, ever, ever, ever get to the
No. It's not. I'm not saying that it'll do that. I'm just thinking about the structural methodology of the argument.
Oh, I can take it or leave it.
That's academic. Of course, you in your loquacious manner, you express exactly what the problem always is. You can always solve it that way. Always say, well, the problem is the sinfulness of man, no matter what is being discussed.
Look, just because it's a good answer doesn't mean it's wrong, okay?